The morning of my 64th birthday, I was standing at the kitchen counter in my housecoat, watching the frost melt off the back window, when my daughter called to tell me she'd already made reservations. Not for a small dinner, not for just the two of us, or even the four of us. For 11 people. At Birchwood, which is the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't have prices on the women's copies, or at least it didn't used to, back when that was considered charming rather than insulting. "We figured you'd want the whole family together," she said. "For the big one." I asked her which big one she meant. She laughed like I'd made a joke. "My name is Dorothy. I'm 64 years old and I live alone in the house my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1988. A 2-story red brick on Maple Ridge Crescent in Guelph, Ontario, with a front porch that needs painting every 4 years and a kitchen that still has the original linoleum because I've never gotten around to replacing it, and honestly, at this point, I don't think I will. Gerald died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. It was the kind of loss you don't prepare for, because preparing for it feels like inviting it in, and by the time you understand what's happening, it's already almost over. I don't say that to set a sad tone. I say it because you need to know who I was before all of this. Before the birthday dinner, before the envelope, before the phone call I made from a hotel room in Prince Edward Island while my daughter was still waiting for me at a restaurant in Guelph. I say it because grief changes the way you let people treat you. And I let things go on far too long. My daughter is Cassandra. She goes by Cassie, has since she was 12, and I've never stopped finding it slightly odd that she shed the name I gave her so easily. She's 38 now, lives in Waterloo with her husband, Craig, who sells commercial real estate, and speaks in the kind of confident generalities that make him very good at his job and not particularly interesting at dinner. They have 2 sons, Oliver and James, who are 9 and 6 respectively, and who I adore completely and separately from their parents, which is something grandmothers are allowed to do. Then there's my son, Philip. He's 41, lives in Kitchener, divorced from a woman named Sandra, who I still think well of, and is currently in a relationship with someone called Britt, who I have met twice. Philip is not unkind. He's just perpetually distracted, the way some people are, always half inside their own heads, nodding along to conversations he's not quite present for. The other people at the table would be Craig's parents, his brother and sister-in-law, Philip's girlfriend, and 2 of Cassie's friends from her book club whom I have met a handful of times. People who are not family in any meaningful sense, but who would apparently be joining us to celebrate my 64th birthday at a restaurant where the lamb chops are $42. I found out the price later. At the time, I only knew it was expensive because Cassie mentioned it with a kind of pride, the way you do when you've secured a table somewhere difficult. "I had to call 3 weeks ago," she said. "It's really popular." I said that was nice. She said, "So you'll want to use the card, right? Since it's a bigger group." I want to be very clear about what she meant by the card. She meant the credit card I gave her 4 years ago after Gerald died, when I was not in my right mind about money or boundaries, or what was and wasn't reasonable to offer a grown adult child who lived in a perfectly comfortable house in Waterloo, and made a combined household income that I knew, from a moment of accidental honesty on Craig's part at Thanksgiving 2 years prior, was substantially more than mine. I gave her the card because she asked, and because I was grieving, and because the particular way she framed it made it feel temporary. And then temporary became indefinite, the way those things do. I'm not going to tell you every charge that appeared on that statement over the next 4 years. I've done that math, and it doesn't make me feel better. What I will tell you is that by last winter, the card had paid for 3 family vacations that I did not attend, a kitchen renovation I was shown photos of after the fact, and 17 dinners. I counted. At restaurants, I was invited to approximately 60% of the time. Philip didn't have the card, but Philip had a different arrangement, which was that whenever he was between contracts, he would call me, and I would each transfer money into his account, and the amounts were always described as loans, and there were no repayment dates attached to any of them, and I had stopped expecting any. Gerald would have put a stop to this years before I did. Gerald was gentle but clear in a way I've never quite managed to be. He had a way of saying, "I don't think that works for us, that close doors without slamming them." I don't have that. I have a tendency to say yes and mean no, and to tell myself later that it wasn't a big deal, that family is family, that money isn't the point. Except money is always partly the point. Anyone who's ever not had enough of it knows that. The birthday dinner was set for a Saturday in late October. I had 3 weeks of notice. That sounds like plenty of time, but I want you to understand that I spent the first 2 of those 3 weeks doing nothing with that information except feeling vaguely nauseated whenever I thought about it. The thing that finally moved me was a phone call from my friend Loretta. Not the one in the file, a different one, my Loretta. Loretta Marsh, who I've known since we worked together at the university library in the early 90s, and who has the particular gift of saying true things without softening them to the point of uselessness. I told her about the dinner, about the 11 people, about the card, about the lamb chops. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, do you want to go?" And the answer, when I sat with it honestly for the first time, was no, I didn't want to go. I didn't want to sit at the head of a table of 11 people, some of whom I barely knew, and eat expensive food I hadn't chosen at a restaurant I hadn't picked, and then pay for all of it as though that were a treat for me, as though being handed a bill for my own birthday was a gift. I said that out loud, and Loretta said, "Well, so don't go." I told her I couldn't just not go. She said, "Why not?" I didn't have a good answer. I had a lot of bad ones. Because Cassie had already made the reservation, because it would cause a scene, because I'd always just gone along with things, and it was very late to stop now. None of those are reasons. They're just the things we tell ourselves when we've confused accommodation with love for so long that we've forgotten they're different. I've been to Prince Edward Island once before, with Gerald in the summer of 2003. We drove from Guelph, which took about 2 days, and we stayed in a small inn outside Charlottetown and ate lobster rolls and walked along the red shore every morning before the tourists arrived. It was one of those trips that doesn't have a single dramatic memory attached to it, just a general warmth. The feeling of being somewhere beautiful with someone you loved without any particular agenda. I'd thought about going back for years. I'd never done it. There always seemed to be a reason not to. Too expensive, too far, not the right time. The children were young. Then Gerald got sick. Then he was gone, and I didn't want to go anywhere without him. Then time passed the way it does, and going alone felt sad, and going with someone else felt like a betrayal, and so I just didn't go. 3 weeks before my birthday dinner, that I did not want to attend, I booked a flight to Charlottetown and a room at a small inn outside the city. Not the same one Gerald and I had stayed in. That one had closed years ago, but one that looked similar in the photos. Painted wood floors, a view of the water from the breakfast room. I booked it for the weekend of my birthday. Return flight Sunday evening. Then I sat with what I'd done for about 45 minutes, half expecting to feel guilty. I didn't feel guilty. I felt something closer to relief, and underneath it, something I hadn't felt in a long time, a kind of quiet aliveness. The particular feeling of having chosen something for yourself. I did not tell Cassie or Philip about the trip. I know that sounds cruel when I put it plainly like that. I've turned it over in my mind many times since, looking for the kinder version of what I did, and I think it's this. I didn't tell them because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Cassie would be hurt in a loud way. Philip would be hurt in a quiet way that he'd express through increasing unavailability. They would both find ways to make my decision about them, about what I thought of them, about whether I loved them, about whether I was punishing them, rather than about what it actually was, which was a 64-year-old woman wanting to spend her birthday, somewhere she loved, in the way she chose, without performing gratitude for a situation she hadn't asked for. I had tried to have direct conversations before, about the card, about the transfers, about feeling like my home was a resource rather than a place someone was happy to visit. Those conversations had gone poorly, Not explosively, just poorly, in the muffled way that happens when the person you're talking to hears something other than what you're saying. Cassie heard criticism. Philip heard accusation. Nobody heard me. So I didn't warn them. I did something else instead. I wrote 2 letters, one for each of them. I wrote them by hand, which took longer than typing would have, but felt right. Gerald always wrote things by hand when they mattered. I didn't write them in anger. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation with these stories is to make the wronged party righteous and cold, and that's not what I was feeling. I was feeling something older and sadder than anger, a deep tiredness, and underneath the tiredness, something that had been waiting a long time to be said. I wrote about Gerald, about the restaurant. This requires some explaining. When Gerald and I were first married, this was 1983, we were both 23, broke in the particular way young people are broke when they're optimistic about it. We used to drive out to a property on the edge of the city that Gerald's father had left him. It was just land then. A converted barn that wasn't fit for anything, a long gravel driveway, fields that went nowhere useful. Gerald had this idea, and I want to be honest that I thought it was impractical. I told him so. I was not always the encouraging wife in the early years. Gerald had this idea of turning the barn into a restaurant. A real one. Not a burger place, not a chain, something that felt like the countryside it sat in. He knew how to cook in the way that some people do, not from training, but from caring about it. It took us 5 years. We did most of the work ourselves, weekends and evenings, with help from Gerald's brother and a rotating cast of friends who we paid in meals. I kept my job at the library and put every spare dollar into the renovation account. Gerald worked days at a hardware store and weekends at the barn. We opened in 1988, the same year we bought the house. We called it the Ridgeline. I will not bore you with the full history of the Ridgeline over the next 35 years, but here are the things you need to know. It became, over time, something people drove out for. It was never famous in any splashy way. It was the kind of place that grandparents took their families for anniversaries, and that couples went to on dates they were hoping would be significant. It had a particular smell. Cedar and something herby, rosemary, I think, and wood smoke from the fireplace in winter, that people mentioned in their reviews more than the food itself, which I've always thought said something true about what the place was. Gerald ran the kitchen. I ran everything else, the bookings, the accounts, the staff schedules, the relationships with suppliers. When the children were small, they came with us on weekends. Cassie used to roll cutlery in napkins and consider herself essential. Philip mostly ate bread from the kitchen and fell asleep on the bench by the door. Gerald died in 2018. The question of what to do with the Ridgeline was the most painful practical thing I have ever had to navigate. We had a manager by then, a very capable man named Terrence, who had been with us for 12 years, and I kept it running through the first year because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But running a restaurant is not something you can do halfway, and I was doing everything halfway. I was barely present even when I was there. I sold it in 2020, to Terrence and his wife, actually, which felt right. They kept the name, they kept the menu, mostly. They changed the wallpaper in the back dining room, which is the only thing I've had any feelings about. Cassie and Philip knew the restaurant existed. They grew up around it. What they did not know, what I had never fully explained to either of them, because Gerald and I always managed the finances privately, and because I am, as I have said, not good at saying true things directly, was what the Ridgeline had been worth. What selling it had meant, financially. They knew I was comfortable. They didn't know what comfortable meant in numbers. And somewhere in that gap, I think, they had decided that whatever I had was bottomless, that there would always be more, that I was a resource and not a person with a finite life, and finite means, and her own ideas about what the rest of it should look like. I wrote that in the letters, not in those words, more gently, more personally. I wrote about what Gerald and I had built together, and what it had cost us, not just in money but in years. I wrote about what selling it had felt like. I wrote about the card and the transfers not with a list of amounts, but as a pattern I'd noticed and hadn't known how to name until recently. I wrote about wanting to be someone's mother rather than someone's safety net. And then, and this is the part I want to get right, because I think it's the most important part, I wrote about what I was doing instead of giving them money. I had called Gerald's financial advisor, a woman I'd worked with since 2019 named Susan, the week before I booked the flights. I had set up education savings accounts for Oliver and James. Not small ones, meaningful ones, set up in the boys' names directly, not accessible to their parents. For my grandson's university, their trades training, whatever they chose to do. It would be there for them. I wrote that in the letters too. I told each of them that I loved their children and I wanted those children to have a start that no one could spend on their behalf. Then I wrote one more thing, which was this. I told them that I was not angry. I told them that the things that had happened over the last several years had happened partly because of choices I'd made. Choices to go along, to stay quiet, to tell myself it wasn't important. That was true and I knew it, and I wanted them to know I knew it. I wasn't writing to make them villains. I was writing to tell them, finally, that I was a person and that I had a life I intended to live. I sealed both envelopes. I did not put them in the mail. I left them on the kitchen table where Cassie had a spare key and had a habit of letting herself in. I left for the airport on a Saturday morning in late October. It was cold, the way Ontario gets cold in late fall, damp and certain, the kind of cold that means it's done negotiating with summer. I had a small carry-on bag, which was all I'd packed. Wool sweater, good walking shoes, the paperback I'd been trying to finish since August. A photograph of Gerald I'd taken on that first trip to PEI 20 years ago. He's squinting into the sun and holding a lobster roll and looking pleased with himself in a way that I've always loved. The flight from Toronto to Charlottetown is about 2.5 hours. I had a window seat and I watched Ontario flatten out and disappear, and I did not feel sad about it. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was going somewhere instead of staying somewhere. I landed in Charlottetown at noon, picked up a rental car and drove to the inn. The woman at the desk was around 30 and had the friendly efficiency of someone who has worked in hospitality long enough to genuinely like people. She called me Han without any artifice and told me the breakfast room had a wood stove if it got cold, and that the Red Shore was about 10 minutes down the road if I wanted a walk before dinner. I went for the walk before dinner. The shore was everything I remembered. Red and calm and very big. The water was gray-green and the sky was doing something complicated with the light, and there was almost no one else there. I stood at the edge for a long time, not thinking anything in particular, just being 64 years old and alive and somewhere beautiful I had chosen. The calls started at 7 that evening. I was sitting in the inn's small dining room eating halibut chowder when my phone began to ring. I watched it ring. Cassie, twice. Then Philip, once. Then Cassie again. I turned the phone face down and finished my dinner. I don't say that to sound cold. I was not cold. My hands were actually shaking a little when I turned the phone over and opened the messages. After I'd paid my bill and gone upstairs. The particular physical manifestation of doing something you've never done before, something that cannot be undone. Cassie's first message, Mom, we're here and you're not. What's going on? Cassie's second, we have 11 people at the table and we ordered appetizers. Where are you? Cassie's third, which came while I was reading the others. The server is asking about the bill. Philip says he can't get you either. We're confused. Philip, Mom, Cassie says you're not there. Are you okay? Call me. Then a gap. Then Cassie, did you get our letters? There were 2 envelopes on the table when I came in to get my sweater. Mom, what is this? I sat on the edge of the inn's bed. The quilt was patchwork, old and soft the way old quilts are, and I thought about how to respond. I thought about it for a long time. Then I wrote, I'm in Prince Edward Island. I'm safe and I'm well. Please read the letters. I love you both. I turned the phone to silent and put it on the nightstand and looked out the window at the dark. Somewhere out there was the water. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I slept better that night than I had in months. I want to be fair about what came next, because fairness matters here more than vindication. Cassie called Sunday morning, and she was not yelling, but she was crying, which is sometimes harder. She said she didn't understand why I hadn't talked to her. I said I had tried to, several times, and that it hadn't worked, and that the letters were my best attempt at saying what I needed to say in a way that could be heard. She said she didn't know it was that serious. I believed her. I think she genuinely didn't know, and I think that was partly her failure and partly mine, and I said both of those things to her. She asked about the reservation. I said I assumed she and Craig had sorted out the bill between everyone, which they had, though she made it clear it had been uncomfortable, and I said I was sorry for the discomfort, and I meant it. She asked about the card. I said I'd canceled it, that it was already done. She didn't say much to that. Philip called in the afternoon. He was quieter than Cassie, which is how he handles things that affect him. He said he'd read the letter 3 times. I said I was glad. He asked if we could talk when I got back, and I said yes, absolutely. And I meant that too. Here is what I did not feel, and I want to be honest about this. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like I had won something. What I felt, sitting in the breakfast room of that inn on a Sunday morning with a cup of tea and a view of the Northumberland Strait going silver in the early light, was something quieter and more durable than winning. I felt like myself, like the person who had stood in a half-finished barn with sawdust on her shoes and looked at her husband and believed that the thing they were building was worth the work. Like the person who had sat beside a hospital bed for 11 weeks and understood, more clearly than she ever had, that time is not a thing you can assume. I had been assuming. For 6 years, I had been letting grief make me smaller, letting accommodation become a habit, letting people I loved mistake my silence for infinite availability. And the thing is, this is the part that's hardest to say. I had let them. That's not blame. That's just the truth. When I flew back to Toronto on Sunday evening, the flight followed the sun west, and the sky went orange and then deep blue. I had the photograph of Gerald in my coat pocket. I took it out and looked at it for a while. I don't believe in talking to photographs, but I thought about what he would have said, and I know what it would have been, because he said it to me once, in a context I've never forgotten. We were arguing about whether to expand the restaurant, and I was afraid. And he looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Dorothy, you are not someone who should be this small." He was right then. He would have been right again. I got home late. The house was quiet in the particular way it gets when you've been away and the air hasn't moved. My kitchen still has the original linoleum. The front porch still needs painting. I made tea and sat at the table where I'd left the letters and looked at the empty space where they'd been. A few weeks later, Cassie and I had a long conversation, the longest and most honest one we'd had in years, maybe in ever. It was not easy. Easy conversations don't change anything. She asked questions I didn't have perfect answers to. I said things I'd been carrying for years and felt them get lighter as I said them. The card is gone. The transfers have stopped. Not because I'm punishing anyone, but because I am 64 years old and I have my own life to fund and my own choices to make, including the trip to PEI and, if I want it, and I'm thinking about it, a longer one. A month, maybe. A small rental somewhere on the Eastern Shore. Oliver and James's education accounts are set up, and they are doing what good investments do, which is grow quietly in the background without asking anything of anyone. And I am still here. Still in the house on Maple Ridge Crescent, still drinking my coffee black, no sugar, still thinking about Gerald every morning and some evenings, still learning, at 64, to take up the amount of space that was always mine to take. It turns out that's not a small thing. It turns out it might be everything.